All right, I think we're all ready to get going. First, I'd just like to thank all of you for being here. I've worked with Paul Rich and his institute for some years and always find it a great opportunity to assist him. My name is David Oppenheimer. I'm with an independent consulting organization. We do work throughout the world, and that brought me to Paul many years back. Today we have a very interesting panel set up on a fascinating subject having to do with rule of law in a civil society. I'd like to introduce my first speaker today, and that would be Brian Kritz of Georgetown University. I'm going to allow each of the speakers to give them their soundbite on who they are and why they're here, since that shifts based on the subject matter. Please, Brian.
My name is Brian Kritz. I teach at Georgetown University. I teach human rights law, international law, rule of law, mass atrocity law, happy things like that. It's a strange life, but it's mine, and I'll take it. Before that, I was a few years ago, I was a legal advisor at USAID in democracy, governance, and human rights. Before that, I worked in Rwanda for the Prosecutor General's Office of Rwanda, helping them rewrite their laws after the genocide. That was now 11 years ago, which is kind of a sobering thought. Before that, I was a criminal prosecutor. So I come to you today as wearing my lawyer hat and my professorial hat. As I said, in 2011, I was on academic loan to USAID. And right when I got there, some really amazing things happened. The wonders of the Arab Spring, or the nonviolent revolution, however you want to define it, happened. And this was really exciting. To be in development, even if I was only there for a year at that time. A lot of excitement, a lot of nerves as to where the U.S. government could park its considerable development dollars, and specifically its rule of law dollars, in countries that were changing. And how can we support legal systems, either formal legal systems or informal legal systems, that both comply with the rule of law, and that are also culturally relevant? So they asked me to do kind of an academic desk study on where the U.S. government could do some interesting work, if anywhere. A lot of times the response is, well, don't put any money into things because we don't necessarily do it very well at times. So my work led to the question, I was able to explore anywhere I wanted. And one place I really wanted to look was Palestine, even though it wasn't necessarily part of everything that was happening in 2011, which led to a paper that I published in Arab Law Quarterly. If anyone wants it afterwards, happy to send you the email, on Palestinian Sulha, or Sul, a community dispute resolution system that's been used in criminal, civil, family, contract disputes in Palestine for millennia. It predates Islam, and it's been used historically by everyone in the region, from Muslims to Jews, Christian, and Druze. Of course, politics often interrupts law. Since 1948, Jews have not been using Sul as a dispute resolution process, but it's an amazingly rich process. And so the question I asked myself and then presented to the office was, does Palestinian Sulha comport with rule of law and rule of law theory? And I've been in the rule of law arena for 11 years. And actually, for a long time, I didn't know what rule of law meant. We all talk about it. We say it. We say rule of law this, rule of law that. But what does it really mean? Rule of law doesn't have a treaty. I wish we did, and I really want to create one. So if anyone wants to join my cadre of fanatics on creating a rule of law treaty, I don't think we'll ever get there because you need so many signatories. But what does rule of law mean at its essence? There's no treaty. We have no founding document. So I wish we had that type of constitutional document. So I looked at this question of, okay, does Palestinian Sulha comport with the rule of law? There are some problems with it. Religious equality could possibly be a problem. It's a problem that I flagged. And the other one is women. Women cannot participate in this community dispute resolution process firsthand. They are represented as litigants, if we could use that very American lawyer word, through their men, whether it's their brothers, their uncles, their husbands, women cannot participate. They can't participate in being Sulha judges, part of the Jaha, which is a group of neutrals that judges any particular dispute, whether it be a murder or whether it be a contract dispute. So my thesis in this paper, and the last time I presented it was at the, how long do I have, by the way? I don't want to.
You've got 15 more. I'll
Super.
give you a warning.
Okay, yeah, throw something at me. How can a process that excludes half of the population, can it comport with the rule of law? And the last time I presented this was at the Max Planck Institute for International Law in Hamburg, Germany. And I think I presented a little too bluntly, and it wasn't particularly popular at the start. So I'm going to say it a little bit more cautiously. This is not a topic I would love to talk about for 15 minutes, maybe for 45 or an hour or two, because what I say in the paper and what I believe is that it does comport with rule of law, even though women don't have firsthand representation. And I start to sweat because I'm nervous that it'll make you angry. I like to have consensus. I was a courtroom prosecutor. We needed 12 jurors all to say yes. I don't necessarily love dissent. But what I'm going to say is, yes, it does. It comports with rule of law standards, and the world trembles, right? Or at least my little world trembles. Not because it's a perfect system, not because the exclusion firsthand of women's access to the system comports with every notion of equality in the world, but rule of law at its essence doesn't mean as much as we all think it does. And rule of law for what lawyers agree that it means isn't a ceiling. It's just the floor. So yes, it does. And it's more of a critique of rule of law than it is in the perfection of this Palestinian process, and a process that's used throughout the region. I'm going to give you a little rule of law theory. I'm sure you're more interested in the Palestine part of this. But there are two theories of rule of law. Formalist theory, and then the substantivist. It's very easy. You don't have to shut down for 5 minutes. I promise it's not too bad. Rule of law theory requires clear rules that are equally applied by a neutral arbiter. This is formalist. Formalism don't care about the substance of laws. They just care that the rules are clear. Everyone knows the game. It's equally applied. People that are rich or from one group or the other don't get preferential treatment when others get poor treatment by a neutral arbiter. And Palestinian Sulha, in my thesis, enjoys formalist rule of law theory. The rules are clear. It's been going on for thousands of years, and people know how Sulha goes from the first step when there's, let's say, a homicide. What happens is that the family of the murderer will approach a Jaha, an independent group of neutrals that live in the community, and say, we need your help. Can you go to the other side and start the process? And when the Jaha goes to the aggrieved family's house, there are words that are said, actual kind of a ritualized process. And there's a response from that family, and then the negotiating process begins. And everything seems to be a very well thought out and planned dance where everyone knows what's to be said, what's not to be said, and how the Sulha process goes. And the Jaha members, the members of this neutral committee, know the rules of how they should act in certain cases. They know precedent. They've often been doing this for a long time. So when I look at whether the rules of Sulha are clear, yeah, everyone kind of knows the drill. From the victims to the alleged the people that commit a crime, to the judges themselves. Is it equally applied? Sulha, in its correct form, doesn't favor the rich or powerful. There are rumors that it does, but in what I've reviewed, there didn't seem to be much proof of that. There are no fees. In the West Bank, there's a tiny fee at the end. But there are really no fees keeping poor people from accessing Sulha. In a number of countries that I've studied and worked, let's say in Liberia, there's a big fees to get to court, and there's big fees to get to certain systems, and it keeps poor people out because they can't afford the system. The rich can buy access. Sulha, it's free. Or there's a little tiny monetary thing at the end that doesn't seem to keep people out. For the most part, Jaha members are not paid. So there's not this huge fee. I worked with judges for a long time, and they all had memberships at the country club because they get paid very well for it. Jaha members, it's kind of an honor thing. And usually they don't have a court building that needs to be administered. They usually work at a neutral site, someone's restaurant, someone's home. It's a cheap process for the most part. So what I see is that it is equally applied in its theoretical form. Of course, there can be anomalies where there was a corrupt Jaha, but if you don't do things right in a Jaha, you're out the next time. And you're kind of embarrassed by being out of the process. People want to be Jaha members, and they keep their equal application as kind of an honor code because they're very honored to do the job. The third part is are there neutral judges? And the answer is yes. Each party can veto any Jaha member they want. If they don't feel that you're neutral, you're off the Jaha for that particular case. All sides have to agree on the Sulha process itself. You can't be dragged into Sulha. It's a, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a voluntary forum. So you can't go there without your permission. You can take it to the formal court system, which has real problems with rule of law and access to justice. But if you don't want to do Sulha, you don't really have to. So with those three things, clear rules, equal application, and a neutral arbiter, it passes formalist rule of law theory. Then we get kind of to the fun part, at least the fun part for me is, okay, substantivist. What does that mean? What's substantive rule of law? Substantive rule of law is our heart. And it only adds one thing. It says, no, you can't just have formal rules because a terribly unfair rule that's equally applied can pass formalist theory. Okay, you're caught stealing, we kill you. If it's equally applied and everyone that's caught stealing and adjudged to be guilty of theft could get killed, that actually applies, that adheres to formalist rule of law theory. It's kind of mean in a way. But substantive theory says, no. There are certain fundamental rights that have to be protected. If we're going to stand for anything as humans, it's got to be some fundamental rights. The two fundamental rights that could be violated, as I see it from Palestinian Sulha, are religious equality, because that seems to be a right in international law, and women's access. And at least historically, Palestinian Sulha passes muster that on religious equality. All the different groups in the region used it for thousands of years. Since 1948, Jews in the region have not used it. It would be a fascinating case study to see if there was a dispute between, let's say, settlers. Wow, that would be really interesting, wouldn't it? Settlers and Palestinian Muslims. What would happen if the settlers wanted to go to Sulha? Wouldn't it be fascinating? But in its essence and form, since it predates Islam, although it does have echoes of the Quran, many, there's nothing to say that someone who is Druze or Christian doesn't get a fair shake in this process, this voluntary process. So, and there have been cases between Druze, Christians, Muslims since 1948. So it doesn't, on its face, have any favoritism towards Muslim persons. Now we get to the part that some people don't like, is the women's access. Women cannot participate firsthand, as I said. Men represent them. They cannot be part of this Jaha process. They can be behind the scenes role as an advocate as the court day ends. The Jaha members go home and speak to their female loved ones, that members, victims, or people that are accused of something can speak to their female colleagues at home, but women don't have a first-hand role. And this is a problem for a number of reasons, but it's not a problem with rule of law, because rule of law is such a skeleton. It's, again, the floor for how poorly you can treat your own people. It doesn't violate rule of law theory. Nothing I found in the academic literature says that a person's right to access in a voluntary, quasi-legal alternative dispute resolution process is a fundamental right. You might say the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the right to be heard in a forum is part of CEDAW. One, Palestine hasn't signed CEDAW. They haven't had the opportunity because they're not considered a state at the moment. There's no indication if they were given the opportunity to sign CEDAW and sign and ratify CEDAW that Palestine would do so. And the academic literature says CEDAW is not yet in toto and in full part of binding customary international law, binding on everybody. So I didn't find anything, and I was really hoping to find, combing through all this legal stuff, something that would say that access to a voluntary alternative dispute resolution system, or the lack of access, is a violation of a basic fundamental legal right. And I couldn't find it. So at the end of the day, what I was forced with saying is something that made me a little uncomfortable, and I tug at my collar a little bit, saying, okay, women can't access this firsthand, but that doesn't mean it violates rule of law. It may be violation of the spirit of equality. It may be a violation of things that we hold dear sitting here in Washington, D.C. Secretary Clinton at the time was the head of the State Department. Well, that wouldn't have passed her secretarial muster. But does it violate rule of law? No, it really doesn't. And again, that's more of a critique about how rule of law is at this small, rule of law is still a very young field. So please join me in creating that treaty that fleshes out everything that people need in order to enjoy the rule of law. So what I want to leave you with is that Palestinian Sulha has been going on been conducted for thousands of years. Most people prefer it to the formal justice system, which is corrupt, rife with influence. It's slow and it's costly. Palestinian Sulha is the choice mechanism for most Palestinians in criminal, civil, contract, all types of disputes. So let's not just tar it with the brush of it doesn't pass rule of law muster, almost if you had a buzzer and could say no, yes, no, yes. The answer is not so clear. Is it perfect? No. But is it something maybe we can engage with and discuss and maybe work at the margins with it to make it more access to justice for women? I think it's something that can be engaged in without fear of violating the rule of law. So I'll end it there. I don't know if you're doing questions now or doing questions afterwards. No one threw anything at me, which is different than at the Max Planck Institute, where people were very upset and interrupted from the very start. I think I was much too blunt about it, instead of being I hope I was a little more gentle at it this time. But any questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, on the question as to whether women's participation disqualifies it as rule of law.
Yeah.
Two points. One is, of course, most of the world didn't include women's participation.
Right.
It still was considered to be under rule of law for a long time.
Sure. And how could it be fundamental if a lot of the world doesn't find that to be in their legal traditions?
But there's another more interesting point I'd like you to address, and that is, it seems to me that whether women's participation or lack of it violates rule of law depends on whether the women get their just representation. in the
Yes,
system.
sure.
So did you do any investigations
did.
to,
Yep.
are they getting justice or are they not getting?
Depends on your men. If your brothers, your cousins, your fathers, your uncles want to listen to you, yes. There is incredible influence upon the process by let's say the woman is the victim of the crime. Women have a lot of say if your men want you to have a lot of say. If they want to ignore what you want to say and pursue their own ideas of justice, there's that right. So it almost depends on how do you get along with your family? What type of family are you from? So yes, there are a lot of cases where women feel very well represented, their interests seem well represented by the men in their family. Other cases, not so much. The access to me interviewing Palestinian women about victimhood were very limited. So I didn't get to actually speak. I spoke to men about their Sulha processes, but I actually never got behind that and was able to speak to their women.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure, if it's a quick one, and then I want to make sure everyone has time.
But just how much flexibility do they have as to which men they can go to? In other words, can they go to anybody in their extended family? Can they go to a civil society organization that will provide them with a record?
Usually it's the leading men in their family, the more powerful men, the older the better. Sometimes I've spoken to a number of people who were young when they took over their kind of family shepherding through the Sulha process, but that's mostly because of the loss of the elder men through conflict. But yes, sometimes it's young men that do it. Yes, sir.
I would like to point out to another point, which is the compatibility between the court and the Sulha thing.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there is cases are processed by the court and
Mhm.
they are referring to the Sulha.
Yeah.
Like they are asking the two sides
Yeah.
of the issue to make a sulha and
Yeah.
to write kind of documents between them.
Sure.
So that they can get rid of the case in the court.
Yes, yeah. Sometimes there'll be parallel proceedings. There'll be a homicide case in the formal courts where someone who allegedly killed will go to prison or not go to prison. But what happens to the families, or the super families, as I call it in the article, the greater clans that want a little bit of revenge for what happened to their family? Sulha is more designed for the bit family writ large instead of the guilt or innocence of one particular person. Although there were a lot of cases where the formal system kind of took a back step and said, okay, could you deal with this with Sulha because it works better and it creates peace between two larger families instead of more animosity when someone goes to prison. And it doesn't. I was a prosecutor for 6 years. It doesn't make people very happy most of the time when someone goes to prison. It's an empty victory a lot of times. Yeah. Yes.
I think what you're talking about it represents a tension that exists in a lot of places and a lot of disciplines between the more traditional ways of doing things and the organic ways of doing things and other things that seem to be imposed. But the problem is, and I'm sure you're not hearing this for the first time, that many, if not most, if not all, of those traditional kinds of systems also discriminate by definition against certain groups, women being one, a major one, and other groups. So who's to say, or who are you to say, and who's anybody to say, that listening to those who are able to speak on behalf of the culture is more important than those within that cultural group whose voices aren't heard. So it's kind of somebody's making a decision what's more important, what kind of axis of conflict is more important, and where it's more important to listen to the indigenous or the local, but the local also means it's discriminative against certain groups, and who says that's less important. And I think that's again, it's not to say that you can't modify, and it's not to say that an external system is better by any means, but it means that to be very careful about about being so in favor of local systems that, again, by definition, can be no less discriminatory than anybody else. And you don't hear the women, and you traditionally wouldn't have heard them or any other of those underrepresented groups. So you're kind of enabling a system of a problematic system to persist.
Yeah, I agree. There are incredible cautions in giving the thumbs up or the thumbs down to anything. The goal of my paper was to point out the richness of the system, the buy-in that Palestinian people have in the system, the acceptance of it, and also the problems with it. What I would like to see, again, and this probably, I should end on this? Okay, is that if we can agree upon what rule of law means in a treaty-type situation, maybe we can better assess these things. But as it stands now, rule of law isn't necessarily violated by Palestinians, so despite the problems that are very
Rule of law is
rich.
the problem.
I think so. I do. Yes, in my heart of, in my warm heart of not formalism but substantivism. Yes, it's a problem. But that's just a theory at this point.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And that. Sorry about that. That's all right. Well, my one comment would be that since this is about a civil society, the only thing I would apologize for right up is that I believe that means that everyone should be able to speak their mind fully and not be moderated by a time. But we apologize. We thank you for your comments. I'd now like to introduce Soumia Bardhan from Penn State University. Soumia, please introduce yourself, set up your goodies. You will have, again, another 22 minutes with questions at the end.
Okay. Good morning. And it sure is a good morning, right? I'm Soumia Bardhan. I teach intercultural communication at Penn State University. And just like Brian, I do have some happy moments teaching intercultural and some not so happy moments where intercultural communication doesn't work much. So to begin this presentation, as a doctoral student, I was a research associate for a project, a federally funded project from 2006 to 2009 that focused on using new media, internet networking, to promote civil society in 4 Middle Eastern countries. Okay, is that good? Okay. 4 Middle Eastern countries, specifically civil society organizations in 4 Middle Eastern countries: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and Jordan. This paper, I have used a case study approach to basically analyze, go back, look at the project, and use my participant observations, interviews with the principal investigator and project members and participants, and use it as a moment for critical analysis and public reflexivity to look at some of the strengths and shortcomings of this endeavor and come up with some lessons and recommendations that could be used for further enhancing capacity building efforts in the region. So today, in the next 15 to 20 minutes, I will first start with giving you a brief overview of the project. Thereafter, I'll talk about some of the claims that I make, and then finally, and for the most part, focus on some of the lessons and recommendations that I see would help future endeavors. So coming to the project. This project started in 2006, October 2006, and it was initiated by an interdisciplinary institute focusing on religion and civil society in a university in Southwest US, and in collaboration with several other organizations in the US as well as in the Middle East, and in the 4 countries that I mentioned in the beginning. The funding came from the Department of State, specifically the Middle East Partnership Initiative, and I will read from the proposal of the original proposal to give you an idea of what the objectives were. So the purpose was to accomplish several project objectives vis-a-vis the Middle East. Number 1, increase networking among non-governmental organizations in the Middle East that work on strengthening democracy. Foster local reflection and planning on how to strengthen the cultural and institutional foundations of civil society. Number 3, create a network of linked websites for the selected civil society organizations. And finally, enhance the ability of citizens to access independent sources of information using new media. So basically, the idea was to do 2 things, 2 action items. Number 1, to conduct a series of train the trainers workshops in the region where civil society organizations from the 4 countries would participate. And they would be trained to have a web presence, to create their own websites. And number 2, to create a central node, a central web portal, which would act as a networking platform where all these civil society organizations could link themselves to and share partner information, collaborate, so on and so forth. So that was the basic idea. Now, coming to, excuse me, should I just use the laptop to?
Yes.
Okay. So this was the overview of the project, and this is what the project wanted to accomplish. Now I'll move on to the claims that I make based off of the lessons learned. Now this project clearly was one of those endeavors that the US government has been very aggressive about to build capacity to promote democracy and civil society in the Middle East. Now, one of the problems, and that's the interculturalist speaking, is most of these projects take a reductive approach to these initiatives. For instance, from this case study, the whole idea of technology can promote civil society, which in turn can promote democracy, is extremely problematic. Why? Because usually these endeavors forget that the Middle East is an extremely diverse region. Each country has its own complexities. Each country has its own political, historical, social, cultural aspects. And without taking culture and context in mind, most of the time, the probability for these projects to be effective doesn't happen. For instance, the specific nature, needs, strengths, and weaknesses of civil society in different Middle Eastern societies must be considered. The Western concept of civil society must be translated into terms appropriate to Middle Eastern contexts. So, in sum, one must focus on culture and context before shaping and creating policies. Now, with this as the claim, I will quickly reiterate, thank you so much, what the project was about. So it was a case study approach through participant observations and interviews. This was a Department of State funded project that went on from 2006 to 2009. The goal was to develop internet-based systems for sharing information among organizations working on societal reform in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. The purpose was to analyze the theoretical framework, approach, execution, and outcome of the project, throw light on the successes and challenges, provide commentary on the scope and concerns of using internet for civil society promotion, and most importantly, justify the claim that robust civil societies and strong democratic institutions can be promoted if the US is mindful to the cultural context, specific needs, and historical capacities of diverse Middle Eastern societies. So now I move on, thank you. Now I move on to some of the recommendations, and I think this is where I want to spend most of my time, and these are some really interesting findings of the study. And at this point, I would read from some excerpts from my paper. So number one, as a communication and interculturalist, communication scholar and interculturalist, I believe that all words are not equal. Some words have more power than others. As Weaver states, certain words and phrases end up being God terms and some become devil terms. During as our project proceeded, the local and regional partners in the Middle East informed the team that the language of democracy had been poisoned as a result of US efforts at democracy promotion in the region, which were often viewed, these projects were often viewed negatively. So it becomes very important to pay attention to the possibilities and politics of language as they play out in different contexts. Democracy has and had, at that point in time itself, clearly become a devil term. Along with concerns about the nature and scope of civil society and democracy promotion, as I just mentioned, attention to the possibilities and politics of language as they play out in different contexts must be considered when designing strategies and shaping policies, because in discourse, terms might hold completely contradictory connotations in different cultures and contexts. Thank you. Number two, hugely important, the quandary of US funding. There was a general wariness of regional CSOs towards a project funded by the US government. That was one of the problems that we were facing from the very beginning. This points to the fact that the success of a project not only depends on its design, implementation, execution, but even before it is launched, by the way actors are positioned in each other's minds and what assumptions actors have or might have of each other's intent. Following from this rationale, it can be inferred that the mere source of funding carried in it the seeds of doubt and mistrust, thus jeopardizing the possible effectiveness of a project focusing on internet for civil society promotion even before its inception. Thank you. Number three. Every Arab Muslim society has indigenous complexities born of profound historical and sociological differences. Now, the analysis in this project, of course, I could not get into the details of that, and I'll be glad to answer questions. This project showed that the certain aspects of civil society in these countries were that the complex and somewhat fragmented structure of civil society, state repression, lack of voluntary citizen action and political apathy, the problem of control and co-optation of civil society organizations by ruling regimes, as well as resistance towards Western ideas and suspicion of the US's motives in the region, all come together to play an important role for civil society dynamics in the Arab world. To ignore these dynamics and approach the issue of civil society promotion from a technopolic mindset is assured to backfire for the most part. Now, technopoly, according to Postman, are those who are convinced that technical progress is humanity's superhuman achievement and the only instrument by which our most profound dilemmas may be solved. So, if you are on Facebook and if you know how to use it, your problems will be solved. You just need to know how to use it. They also believe that information is an unmixed blessing, which through its continued and uncontrolled production and dissemination offers increased freedom, creativity, and peace of mind. However, technology by itself or technological success as seen in one context and culture does not naturally guarantee success in another context. What might work in an advanced democracy like the US or even India might not work in other parts of the world, in countries in the Middle East. The elimination of all other indigenous cultural complexities, the conception of technology as autonomous and self-determinative, independent of human action, in short, the deification of technology must be checked so that the participatory potential of the internet can be fully and effectively reached, and in the case of my study, by CSOs in Arab Muslim societies. Finally, to move on to the last lesson, a toolkit approach or custom solutions. Now, media and technology theorists argue that in order to maximize the utility of communication technologies, one has to understand the value system of technology. Now, what does that mean? What is the meaning of value systems? According to Mishra, every technology has 4 components which kind of creates a value system for that technology. And these 4 components are content, collaboration, community, collective understanding. Content. New media tools allow everyone, and I think all of us would agree, it allows everyone who has access to it to become a creator by making the publishing and distribution of much of multimedia content both free and easy, even for amateurs. Collaboration. New media facilitates the aggregation of small individual actions into meaningful collective results. Number 3, community. New media facilitates sustained collaboration. I think this is an important word, sustained collaboration around shared ideas and interests over time and often across space. Finally, collective understanding. The social web enables not only aggregation of individual actions, but also the ability to do sophisticated analysis of communications dynamics to better understand the group's work. That is, if that analysis and understanding through several statistics is shared back to the community, members find more value in the community, allowing the community to grow even more. Now, once we understand that technology has this value system, one also needs to keep in mind that the most effective new media and communication technology initiatives leverage all 4 layers. But at the same time, different media technologies have separate skills and separate strengths. For instance, Facebook has probably the potential to do the content phase and collaboration phase and the community phase, but maybe not the collective understanding. So what I'm trying to state here is, before one tries to look at technology and tries to use it for community building or civil society promotion, one has to understand what can this technology provide. And second, what does these organizations need? Do they want to just go online and create their content and make themselves visible? Do they want to collaborate? Do they just want to be at the collaboration stage for a specific purpose, for a specific demonstration? Or do they want to take it a step further and create a community? And finally, do they want to go in for a collective understanding? So the idea is to know how and what is the potential for each of these technologies and what is the requirement of these civil society organizations. Now, without keeping that in mind, a toolkit approach where you just go in there and you want to push your initiative into a civil society organization's sense and actions becomes problematic. The most effective communication technology initiatives leverage all 4 layers and provide custom solutions. So you have to know, you have to talk to these people, you have to understand their culture, you have to understand the context. Why do they want to use it? And it's only this way that such initiatives can be most effective. So as I wrap up, the Middle East is clearly includes a diverse range of cultures, and the U.S.-Middle East relationship is hugely complex. The purpose of my paper was not to really focus on these complexities, but give you an overview of how important culture becomes, context becomes, even before you start designing anything, and how it should really be the starting point of any of these initiatives. And the aim was to, especially in the wake of the Arab uprisings in the region, the aim and the hope here was to offer, policymakers and scholars a new path forward for the promotion of democratic institutions in the region, one that combines the lessons of the past with the opportunities of the future. Thank you.
Just a few moments for some questions.
Yep.
Thank you for your information. I noticed that you didn't mention in any of this study the necessity of economic prosperity. I mean, if you have a society that people have to struggle from morning to evening for basic needs, they're not going to be worried about the internet cafes, their technology. I mean, if we're going to promote sanctions in most of these countries that we're having problems with, the role of a civil society will be pretty much demolished.
I think you're absolutely right. And in fact, that is what I was trying to get at. And thanks for pointing that out and for making it clearer. That's exactly what I mean. If the culture requires that, and if the culture does not require this, then policymakers and academics should focus on that. So the point that I was trying to make is exactly what you said. You have to understand the culture. You have to understand that maybe these people right now need our support with that aspect and not so much of this. So don't go in with these custom solutions and tell them, okay, go start networking. Maybe they need new media for a different purpose, to just talk to each other about economics and how to improve. So yeah, I totally agree with you. Completely agree with you.
So a lot of the problems that you're talking about are perhaps best addressed by reforms on the part of the funder, MEPI in this case. And as I'm sure you know, it's a lot to ask. So do you have any thoughts on, for organizations implementing projects like the ones you've looked at, if you take some or all of these problems as givens, what are the best ways to be successful with these projects?
The moment you are being funded by an organization like MEPI, and as you clearly mentioned, that it's not very easy to go in there and tell them, okay, change things. You have to understand that there will be some constraints. But I believe that when you are designing a project, it's best to have more conversations with these organizations themselves before you decide what you want to go. For instance, the training workshops that we designed. I think it would be a great idea, instead of going in there thinking we know what they need, do a survey or talk to people, spend some time with them and find out what they require, what would help them most. Instead of, so I think the answer to your question is spend more time with your consumer. And I don't want to use the word consumer, but the people or the organizations who you are supporting, to spend more time with them, and also be realistic about the constraints that you might have when you are looking for funding.
Can I ask again which countries you were?
Yeah, sure. Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan.
Okay. I kind of have a policy recommendation too. It seems I used to work for the NGO coordination committee of Iraq. So actually, these kinds of like portals of information have been around for a while.
Right.
Countries have been developing them. One thing that MEPI could do more, so if they want to impose a solution like this, it'd be nice if they open this up for bids and people to actually, because we could have used that funding, for instance. Although at the same time, I don't think we could have taken American funding because of that consideration working in occupied Iraq.
Right.
So, but something like that shouldn't be, I think, labeled and put onto a certain country, imposed on a country, but rather people that already work in countries that already serve as nodes, could really use that funding.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we should talk more.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, our Our next speaker will be C. Brandt Smith from American Military University. Correct the mic for yourself and take a moment to introduce yourself. One has to remember while this is being prepped that the thoughts you just heard were very progressive at the time. The world changes so fast, and now we're used to all of these Twitters and Facebooks. That was very early on in all of this.
All right. Thank you very much. I do represent American Military University and School of Security and Global Studies. I have a couple of colleagues here today, Dr. Dick Para and Jill Kritz. And we tend to deal with each other by phone or email, so it's nice to put a face to the names. I'm going to be discussing some research I did in Iraq. I was fortunate to have been invited to lead an NGO in Iraq between 2006 and 2008. The caveat to that was my wife would accompany me along with our 12-year-old daughter. We would not live in the red zone or in the green zone, but in the red zone, out in population. And so my neighbors, very basic local national Iraqis. And so as we integrated into the society where we live, we discovered that when they suffer, we suffer. If they had electricity, we had electricity. No water for them, no water for us. And what I discovered before I began a lot of this detailed research was there's something about mutual suffering that pulls people together. And so the topic of conversation many mornings over chai was, how many hours of electricity did you have yesterday? Or are you still without water? And all of those kinds of things. But it endeared my neighbors to us and allowed us to have some common ground where we could discuss events of the day. And so when I began to really look at society, I discovered that as an outsider looking in, there were advantages and disadvantages, and I wanted to maximize the advantages. And so as an American, a lot of times people saw me as, say, chief of party or country leader for an NGO as the money man. I had people coming in my office all the time. They were 12 and 14-hour days, as you know, being in Iraq, where we just worked all the time. I got to where I would crawl under my desk and lay on a pillow for about 15 or 20 minutes every day to recharge my batteries because of the intense pressure and stresses. Conducting workshops and helping build schools, trying to do a presentation like we're doing this morning with mortars and rockets and car bombs going and the water bottle shaking on the table in front of me. The uninterrupted power supply unit keeping the projector rolling and the computer moving because electricity was sporadic. But when I began to do some serious study on the effects of current leadership models in Iraq, one of the things that really drew me to the people was a statement by Irving Goffman, a Canadian sociologist, and maybe many of you are familiar with the name, but he was recorded as having said the following concerning research. You are close to them while they're responding to what life does to them. He said, I feel that the way this is done is not, of course, just to listen to what they talk about, but to pick up on their minor grunts and groans as they respond to their situation. Further, he stated, when you do that, it seems to me the standard technique is to try to subject yourself, hopefully, to their life circumstances, which means that although, in fact, you can leave at any time, you choose not to leave. And you stay and accept all the desirable and undesirable things that they endure. He said, that tunes your body up. And after pulling debris off of my rooftop and picking up spent bullets and navigating through checkpoints and dodging various activities that would have ended our life, my life, I felt like that common suffering meshed me to my Iraqi neighbors. And he goes on to say, because you're taking the same crap they're taking, you can identify with them. And so I learned really quick that my Iraqi neighbors were just like me. They loved their families. They loved their country. They loved education. They loved business. They wanted to be successful. They wanted better for their children than they had. And the majority of Iraqis never have known one single day of peace. Year after year of war, year after year of turmoil, chaos, and the traditional aspect of wasta, where someone helps you, you help someone. In the chaos of the time, sometimes even wasta is not enough to get people where they really want to be, because there's no leverage. There's no substance. Everybody is crying for help, and at some point, one has to say, I've done all I can do. I can't do any more. And so with that, let me just mention, I stayed in Iraq. I first went in 2005. I was only going to be there a couple of weeks, do my thing, kind of a drive-by Western training event, and then I would exit. But as a result of those few weeks in Iraq, I was invited back, and I stayed until mid-2011, and so I lived in country. I took residency. I lived on the economy. I bought a taxi for personal use so I could get around and get around the laws of even and odd days of driving with those license plates. Because I had so much ground to cover, I just said to my office assistant, "Can I buy a taxi?" And Zena said, "I think so." Within 2 days, my office manager and assistant came back and said, "It's really yellow." But we drove and we covered Baghdad, and I traveled around the country coordinating efforts for approximately 45 staff, and deeply cared about these people. But I want to talk to you about the research that I did, because it really expresses the perceptions of the Iraqi people. And I don't think I would have had access to their responses if I hadn't been in that lived experience with them. I buried 125 friends in 2 years. It was horrendous. I paid for funerals out of my pocket. And there's something, as I said, about mutually sharing suffering that welds people together. And so I want you to know, as we go through this, these are not my Western notion of what these people are going through, but this is what they told me. They knew me as the Mudir, they knew me as Habibi, they knew me as just a caring individual. And I think that helped me, as Irving Goffman say, get into their world and experience. It was a lived experience. And so the phenomenon of what I experienced, I want to share with you today. Next slide, please. This is what I saw. There's a leadership model acceptable to the Iraqi people. I think the Iraqi people are the best judge for themselves what type of leadership they really want. Sometimes we outsiders, we come in and we say, I know what you need, I know what you want, just sit back, I'll build it, and then I'll hand it over to you. The problem with that is, and this is from my own personal observation, just because I say I know what you need doesn't necessarily mean it will be bought into. I discovered that if it's not reproducible and sustainable after I leave, there's little value to the people that receive it. And so I do believe there is a leadership model acceptable, and that the people of Iraq would include, because I asked them, these following qualities. They want a leader with personal integrity, one that's honest, well-educated, strong politically, with a youthful spirit. To date, Iraq suffers from many self-seeking, corrupt, dishonest, and untouchable leaders separated from the reality of the common person. As I sat in the various mudifs As I sat in various meeting halls with Iraqi elders in villages, even with some members of parliament, they would tell me, we traded one tyrant for hundreds, and we're in trouble. And so, next slide, please. Here was one of the questions I asked. In Iraqi society, do more people live for the present than live for the future, or do more people live for the future than live for the present? Because of the chaos and turmoil, they said, 90% said we live for the day. There's no guarantee of tomorrow. As a matter of fact, when I did some training for Iraqna or Zain, the telecommunications company, their upper management told me, hey, we're all in the queue for death. We just don't know when our day is, but we're all in line. Only 5% said they live for the future. That is another incredible aspect of the Iraqi people. They have hope, but it depends on what is happening in their life at the exact moment. And then 5% have mixed feelings. Next slide, please. Power brokers and lower class. Iraqis in positions of power try to increase their social distance from less powerful people or decrease their social distance from less powerful people. 91% said when they voted for an individual to some public office, they noticed that that person increased their social distance. It was like, you helped me get where I want to go, but then all of a sudden, I don't need you anymore. That sounds like things that are happening maybe in other countries around the world. But then 9% said they decreased social distance. So there is a unique 9% group of people out there, but 91% said no. I got what I want and I'm moving on. I'm moving up. Next slide. Tolerance for errant leadership. This is another unique quality that I respect in the Iraqi people. They're very tolerant people. They treated me, I would make so many mistakes. I was the token Western guy in many of the meetings, and they loved me anyway. Not because of anything I deserved, but I asked questions about their tolerance, and they would say, 35% of the respondents said, what difference does it make what I think about what a leader does? But 55% said, I think we're very tolerant and forgiving, but it goes back to what difference does it make? And then there were others that said, no, 10% of we Iraqis, we're intolerant and unforgiving. And I think it had to do with their personal experiences and what they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis. Next slide, please. Perceptions of a good leader. Because my background is in leadership studies, I wanted to know. When describing a good leader, what words would you use? And if you notice, my questions are not closed-ended questions. They're not yes and no. They're open-ended. This is a qualitative study, and I kind of came to the realization that qualitative research methodologies are personal because you rub elbows with people. If I stuck with quantitative research methodologies, I dealt with numbers and somebody else's research. So this was seminal. But here was some of the things that they said, and I'll focus on the top three. Iraqis wanted an honest politician. I think all of us value that character quality. They also valued education, and then they also valued someone that was strong. And they said to me, one of the primary issues where Saddam Hussein failed, and even though a lot of people suffered under him, they still respected him. They said, first of all, he was a strong military leader. And he was a strong political leader, but where he failed was in the area of spirituality. Because as I sat with Iraqis, they would tell me, we want a leader that is spiritual, political, and has a military strength because we want the rest of the world to recognize us for who we are and what we bring to the global economy, to the world. And you can see all the way around down to they want a leader that's patriotic, but they would take a strong leader over a patriot any day because they value that. That's something that I saw in the Arab world. Strength is something very significant in that region of the world. Next slide, please. Okay. Experiences with current leaders. Look at this real quick. 61% of the Iraqis, and I worked in 8 provinces in southern Iraq. I met with hundreds and thousands of people. And so 61% said they got my vote, but they never came back. I have no interaction. I don't even know who my representatives are. Bad experience, 15%, and insincere leadership, 15%. Dishonesty, 9%. Next slide. In what ways has current leadership in Iraq impacted you? Please explain. No impact. That's why democracy is not working like we would like to see in Iraq, because the people don't see it as working. These elected officials have no impact. They do say that security in the Iraqi army have improved 10%, but is that enough to sustain the people of Iraq? Next slide, please. In your opinion, what kind of leadership does Iraq need? Honest, educated, strong-handed. And they really put that strong-handed is they need a leader who'll tell them what to do, because that's the model they're used to. They'd like to have a benevolent dictator, but the chances of getting a benevolent dictator in that part of the world are real slim. Next slide. If you voted in a recent election, what influenced your choices? This was incredible. Women's group, 16%. I did meet with several women, and they said, our women's group, because there were issues that were important to us. Family, and then others. But next slide. I'm watching the clock. Voice leadership expectations. You can see that. Security was 12. But if you look at some of these, essential services. If you were in Iraq at all and working with an NGO or State Department or a PRT or anything, you heard essential services all the time. People just want water, electricity, and sewage. You know, they just need those things. Next slide. Do the people of Iraq generally want their leaders to be tough or tender? It was 100%. Everybody said, no, we don't want a tender leader. That's weakness. You know what I mean? That's weak. We want a strong leader because we want the respect of our neighbors. Next slide. In Iraqi society, what kinds of special privileges? This was the big gap. Most people said they only want the money. They only want the money. They'll serve us, but they want the money. They want the power. They've got their own security. I even noticed, I documented, a lot of water and electricity went to the homes of the elected officials and stopped right there with a village of several hundred 10 feet away, but they couldn't connect up because they didn't have the wasta or the power. Next slide. This was incredible. Male leadership ascension, 86%. Open to female leadership, 14%. But you know what they said the big issue was in Iraq with women in leadership, even though the Constitution allows it or mandates it? They only think in terms of sexuality, sexual aspects of the woman. So they said, we can't respect her. But they did say this: if a woman distinguishes herself educationally and socially and actively in specific causes, men would respect her. But it goes back to what you said. They will be listened to by the family, and then it will branch out. And the last one here that I'll stop with. The possibility of women gaining 50% of the leadership. 4% said it wouldn't make a difference. 17% said they're open, and these were men and women. But 79% of the Iraqi men that I talked to said it's impossible. That's it. There's more, but sorry. If you're really interested, you can get a copy of a book. If you give me your address, I'll send you a copy.
We have just a moment for a question or two.
Yeah, Maliki and Alawi, I mean, how would you off the record, but what is the respect for these two major leaders?
Well, we're on the record because we're videoing.
Okay.
But let me tell you, I was around President al-Maliki. You know, I was around Prime Minister al-Maliki, and I shared a wall to an office with Dr. Alawi. He would even come over, security would come over and ask us to grill hamburgers because he loves American hamburgers. And so I sat at the table with him on a few occasions. I think both of these men have some good ideas, but one, and you can determine who I'm referring, One seems to be heavily influenced by Iran more than the other. And as long as Iranian influence controls and dictates what happens in Iraq, there's going to be continued chaos and violence. But it also goes back to the Sunni Shia difficulties. And you know, my staff were made up of Sunnis, Shias, secularists, and Christians. And we never had problems inside our office because we respected each other. But when respect is not there, you're going to have these conflicts. But we saw one militia after another, and to get into my office, I had to walk between 250 caliber, machine guns, one by a Ministry of Electricity, one by Alawi's men, and then on the other end, the Kurds with theirs, they were protecting the Ministry of the Interior. It's just, both of those men have probably insurmountable difficulties, and until they become so war-weary that they really are willing to sit down and do what's right for the people, it's not going to stabilize. And the emails I get actually say that. And this is a current event from the newspaper. Muqtada al-Sadr is a big player. He says Iraq is being governed by bloodthirsty wolves and people panting after money while leaving the people engulfed with suffering and fear. There's going to have to be some serious sitting down and discussing the people's problems and not what leadership gets out of it. And the people of Iraq see it. And so I am biased, I admit it. I care about the people, and it's going to take some work. Roll up your sleeves, get busy.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
As I apologized earlier, each of these deserve a full day. Okay, last today we have Sarah Tobin from Northeastern University. We're pleased to have you. Please introduce yourself and adjust your mic.
Well, the next panel is scheduled to start in here in about 15 minutes. So I'll do my best to get through it and get you all out in time for the next one. My name's Sarah Tobin. Can you hear me all right with the microphone? Great. I am the Carnegie Visiting Scholar and, this is unfortunate, and the Assistant Director of the Boston Consortium for Arab Region Studies. It's a new project, a new initiative that the Carnegie Corporation is funding, and we're trying to develop a cohort of strong folks who are investigating pertinent issues to the Arab region and its diaspora. Next slide. All right, so in the case of Jordan, there are three primary issues and strategies that have really defined the sort of political, economic, and cultural landscape prior to and during the Arab Spring. They include politics and protest, economic growth, internal cultural debates. And often these three cleave along ethnic lines. Not entirely, but typically the literature in the West points to each of these as having a particular ethnic sort of character to them. The makeup of Jordan is here in this pie graph. The total population of Jordan is 6.5 million people. There's approximately 32% of the population that are ethnic Jordanians. They're East Bankers, as they're referred to, residents of the East Bank of the Jordan River, their descendants. They stand at about 2 million people. It's considered, although again there hasn't been a census, so it's difficult to know for sure, it's believed that about 50% of the population in Jordan are Palestinian, refugees and their descendants as well. About 7% of the population is currently believed to be Iraqi. That will include Assyrians and Mandeans, as well as other populations that came to Iraq during the last decade or two. There's approximately 9% of the population that are believed to be Syrians, Syrian refugees. I'm actually leaving this afternoon for Jordan to go conduct research in Zaatari, as well as the other refugee camps, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to understand this newly developing and growing population more intimately. Approximately 2% of the population are Circassians, and less than 1% include others, people like Egyptians, foreign workers, South Asians, Westerners, Western residents as well. So prior to 2001 and during the Arab Spring, the Jordanian government addressed these three issues in three sort of segregated ways that emphasize these cleavages along ethnic lines. They include political reform by the repeated sacking of prime ministers and alterations in protests. This was particularly true for addressing East Banker concerns. The second concern of economic growth was often addressed through neoliberal reforms for economic stability and growth. This was particularly aimed at Palestinians, who are believed to occupy more private sector kinds of endeavors. Again, this is an oversimplification, but going through the Western literature does point to over and over these kinds of cleavages and the ways by which the Hashemite government has tried to address them. And then finally, there are these internal cultural debates. Jordan has some perpetual concerns about what is referred to as al-Watan al-Badil, the alternative nation. That if Jordan were to do a census, and if they were to see that more than 50% or 50% of the population, the majority demographic are in fact Palestinian, what's to keep Jordan from becoming a Palestinian state? And therefore removing concerns about right of return. And so to address these internal cultural debates, the government has taken on some nationalist building aims. Next slide. So in this paper, I argue that during and since the Arab Spring, the government has begun experimenting with and managing new forms of political and economic reforms and transitions, as well as the ways by which they can alter and influence the internal cultural differences and diversity, which is growing. The Hashemites are, for lack of a better term, learning. They are learning how to manage their precarious position of being always on the brink of political, economic, and cultural uprisings for purposes of stability in a region that is still deeply troubled by the Arab Spring events and an uncertainty into the future. During the Arab Spring and the post-Arab Spring milieu, King Abdullah and the Hashemites have largely moved away from the previous strategies and division of labor. So this sort of tripartite separation of ideas and solutions, problems and solutions rather, is something that the government is trying to move away from, I'm arguing. It's no longer sufficient for them to assume that one's issues realm, politics, economics, or culture, can be sufficiently addressed with a response in the same conceptual space. Rather, the Hashemites are now embracing what I'm calling a political economy of stability, which integrates these three areas into a singular and yet more complex approach. So I'm examining this new approach of a political economy of stability through the lens of Jordan's bid to join the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. Next slide. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this very quickly to sort of go through these three parts. In the case of politics, as I mentioned, this is typically considered to be an East Banker issue, one that Jordanians are largely concerned with. Jordan, as you all know, is a constitutional monarchy with a prime minister. Historically, since independence of Jordan, there have been 58 prime ministers, 35 of whom were actually different. So there's only been 35 different prime ministers, many of whom were appointed with repetition over a span of number of years. However, since 2011 to 2012, there were five prime ministers, 3 of whom were different. And so you do see the acceleration on the part of the Hashemite authorities, namely the king, to dismiss and reappoint prime ministers to appease East Bank political interests. Gillian Schredler has referred to Jordan as a liberalized autocracy, which I think is pretty apt. But for East Bank populations, the system of patronage and political acquiescence is one that they've developed over these years. And this emerges quite clearly in the case of protest. Over the history of Jordan's constitutional and legal endeavors, there has been a format and a forum for protests to take place. And so Western audiences often see protesters in Jordan and become very nervous. But from a historical perspective, it's not unusual to have people out protesting. And in fact, in 2011, the consent to hold rallies in public assembly, the law, was quietly suspended. And so it's no longer necessary to receive governmental approval or to report even a protest that has been dismissed. Protest is now legal and open. In the second case, economic growth, the patronage system, subsidies, and resource imports, particularly oil and water, are very expensive. And as a case in point, flour, this is, oh, sorry, next slide. I've got two computers going. So in the case of flour, the Jordanian government, through the Ministry of Industry and Trade, buys all-purpose flour, not wheat. So they buy the processed flour on the international market for approximately $247.50 per ton. Then they in turn sell the flour in Jordan to bakeries and other points of distribution for $50 a ton. There's a huge cost. The subsidy for flour alone is a strong economic burden for the government. So they've instituted a number of IMF measures in the 90s and 2000 trying to stabilize GDP and trying to account for some of these high costs of their patronage system and the subsidies. Jordan is incredibly resource poor and relies heavily on foreign aid, both from Saudis and other Gulf countries, as well as from the US and from the West. Next slide. Okay, so I'm just going to jump ahead. Citizens of the GCC countries, including Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates, constitute some of the wealthiest in the world. In 2010, Qatar's per capita gross domestic product and purchasing power parity was the first in the world. By contrast, Jordan would struggle to survive financially without aid from the EU, US, and Saudi Arabia. Furthermore, living standards in Jordan are modest, with per capita incomes in 2010 of only $5,400. So you do see this huge economic disparity. Nonetheless, on May 10th, 2011, Jordan and Morocco submitted bids to become members of the GCC in an economic and political cooperative relationship. The alliance brings with it a series of objectives such as regulatory consistency, a shared currency. Oh, sorry, can you advance to the slide that says Jordan joins the GCC at the top? This is one artist's rendering of what a common currency could look like. What is at stake? Jordan, by joining the GCC, would get cheap oil and financial assistance, and the GCC would get Jordan's military expertise and Western diplomatic ties, as well as a workforce known by the Dubai Chamber of Commerce as the most efficient and low cost in the region. Can you jump ahead to 2 slides? One more. Oh, sorry, no. One before. Apologies. So the announcement was made. Jordanians responded with humor, which was really quite a fascinating kind of response. There was tremendous joking and sarcasm about the deep national differences that exist between Jordan and the Gulf countries. Furthermore, such humor often put Jordanians on the offensive rather than the defensive, asking would or should Jordanians adopt Gulf social and cultural customs, even if they brought political stability and economic opportunity. So the ensuing jokes played out often about things like dress, how to wear a gotra, with a number of links to them. Next slide. There were jokes about the geography. I mean, the fact that Jordan borders only Saudi Arabia and marginally and is not really a Gulf country is one that a number of people also played out. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. Oh, sorry, can you go back one more? The lifestyle contests were very interesting. There were a number of people who came out saying, like, bye-bye Kia Sophia, welcome, welcome, with a funny Gulf kind of accent attached to it. Welcome, the Land Cruiser. You know what? I've changed my mind. The GCC Joe is great. Let's pop open a bottle of champagne to celebrate while we still can. And so in conclusion, this case demonstrates 2 important points. First, the tweets and responses in social media by Jordanians all speak to a public dialogue about class nationalism, in particular a middle-class nationalism, and do so in relatively offensive terms rather than defensive terms. Jordanians won't easily accept GCC culture, even if it involves more money and more stability, particularly economic and political stability. The costs to an emergent middle-class Jordanian national identity end up being too high. As such, these responses amplify the notion that there's a kind of Jordanian nationalism found in the Muslim middle class, and it's one that prides itself on contrasting values of diversity in dress and public representations, democratic processes of openness and some freedoms in expression, and in localized Islamic understandings of the role and purposes of wealth. Secondly, the political economy of stability framework, which I unfortunately did not have a lot of opportunity to delve into, does actually prove to be a fruitful framework, moving away from the sort of tripartite model to one more integrative model. It simultaneously demonstrates the dynamism of stability, including the possible combinations for its engenderment and the outcomes that may result from such assemblages. Other studies of Jordan joining the GCC, for example, can and do overlook the cultural variables and the potentially integrative effect that joining the GCC can have on Palestinian and Jordanian ethnicities. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. And I apologize for